My name is Levi Zitting. I'm a developer at Mostly Serious. We're a web dev shop in downtown Springfield here. I've only been working there a couple months, but we use Django quite a bit there. In fact, most of our projects are built in Django. We do a lot of more marketing type sites, so generally we're building using some kind of content management system. There's a few of them out there for Django, such as Wagtail, and another one, Mezzanine, and we use both of those. We're not going to be diving into that today, though. But my role at Mostly Serious is more in the front-end realm. That's where most of my experience is. But I'm also getting much more into just full-stack stuff in general. I wasn't a Python user before I started there, mainly just some messing around on a Raspberry Pi here or there. But I have grown to really love the language since I've started, and Django especially. It's a really powerful framework. But like I said, most of my experience was in front end, and so I was really digging into some of these JavaScript-heavy front-end frameworks, and I was really liking the workflow where you build out REST APIs and your front end consumes them, and you have that nice, clear separation where they're completely decoupled, and you can just worry about the front end or just worry about the back end. And so I wanted to figure out how to do this in Django. The only back-end language I knew back then was PHP, and I knew a little bit of the Laravel framework, so I used that. But since I'm going to be working at Mostly Serious and doing a lot of front-end stuff there, I wanted to figure out how to do it well in Django. So I kind of set out with a few problems in mind that I wanted to figure out how to solve. And over the past month, I've done quite a bit of research to try and solve these problems. And there's three that I'm going to be showing off tonight. The first is using Webpack with Django, because a lot of these front-end frameworks take advantage of a build step and it can be a little bit hard to integrate with Webpack in some scenarios. We'll show off a couple of them in just a second. The second thing that I wanted to figure out was how do you do REST APIs well in Django. Spoiler alert, it's Django REST framework, and we're going to show off some of the basics of it. And then the third thing that I wanted to figure out was how to handle authentication in a single page app, because normally Django, as far as I know, uses session-based authentication, which can be a little bit hard to manage in a single page app sense. So I wanted a good solution for authentication, preferably something token-based. So the final part of this presentation is going to be showing off some JSON Web Token stuff for doing authentication. I put together like a little, very basic single-page app, and we'll kind of walk through. I'll show you what it looks like finished, and then we'll start to build out the back end for this. We won't dive into the front-end code too much. If there's some time at the end, and if anyone wants to see it, we certainly can. But let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to go ahead and start up this little app here, and it's pretty basic. The main thing that I wanted to show off was, reading data from Django as JSON, and then also the authentication part. So if I come over here, I have like a place to log in, and I have just like an admin user I can log in as. And then there's like a list view with some posts on this message board. And once a user is authenticated and logged in, they can create new posts. And there's also like a detail view for each individual post. And then they show up in the list view once they create it. But they have to be authenticated to actually create it. So we're going to be kind of building out the back end for this. Like I said, it's very simple, but I wanted to fit everything in tonight. So let's also, the front end, for anyone curious, is written in Vue. I know I was talking about that a little bit beforehand. But yeah, I'm using Vue on the front end. So I have a whole bunch of branches, which I also have the code for this whole thing up on my GitHub page, which I'll share at the end. So we'll check out the beginning and open it up in my code editor. Can you guys, let me open up like a code file. Can you guys read that? Should I make it bigger? I'll make it just a tad bit bigger. Like 15. How's that? Bigger? Go like one bigger. Okay. So I have all of my front-end code in here right now and the basics of a Django backend. I have this message board app with a single model in here, just a single post, and that's actually like the only interesting thing. I did register it in the admin page, so we can visit the admin and add posts if we need to. But let's get started with that first thing that I talked about. How many of you are familiar with Webpack, like know what it is? Okay. So Webpack is a module bundler for JavaScript because JavaScript doesn't really support like import statements like Python does, especially in the browser. There kind of is some stuff like that in Node. And Webpack is kind of a way to emulate that in the browser. But at the same time, because it's kind of reading through our code and doing all this import magic for us, we can do some transformations on our code, such as converting new modern JavaScript to stuff that runs in older browsers at the same time. And single page apps, or most of these front-end frameworks take extreme advantage of this. So I'm going to go ahead and check out this branch, which has a basic Webpack config and some settings in Django to make everything work. Let's go ahead and load that up. So one really awesome feature with Webpack is that as it builds your files, it outputs these bundles, which is just all of your code bundled into a single file. And there's a feature where it will automatically add a hash of the file into the file name, so it'll automatically do cache busting for you. And kind of the problem is that you don't want to, in your Django templates, go and update your script tag to have that long file name every time that it changes. So that's where I wanted this kind of Webpack integration. I wanted that cache busting thing to happen automatically. So the good news is that there's an awesome Django app out there called Webpack Loader that makes this super easy. So I've already installed like all of my dependencies that I'm going to be using tonight, but I'll point out like where I use them. So in my settings file, I have this Webpack Loader app it added to my list of installed apps. And I've just pulled that in through pip. It's a package available on pip. And what this does for me is if I go into my base template, it adds this render bundle template tag. And basically what this does is it will read a special file that Webpack can output that tells it the name of a bundle and then the actual file name. We'll take a look at that in just a second. But this will automatically read that stats file. It's called a stats file. And it will render out the full path to that file, including that hash. So the automatic cache busting works. Really quickly, I'm going to just jump into my Webpack config. I'm using a Webpack configuration provided by Vue. They have a couple defaults set up. But the interesting thing is I pulled in this package from NPM called Webpack Bundle Tracker. And then it's a plugin that you add to Webpack. And so I just instantiate a new instance of this plugin, and I tell it where I want those stats to go, which is just going to be in a JSON file in the root of my project. And whenever I run my build, it will output that file. So I actually ran my build a second ago. So right here, we actually have a sample stats file. It tells us where our file is living. And the reason that this, it tells us kind of the base URL for all of our files right here. And then this is our main bundle with some information about the file name and where it lives. The reason that this is like a fully qualified URL right here is Webpack has a feature called hot module replacement, where it will automatically just update your front end, like either reloading the page or injecting some JavaScript whenever it changes. And so if I have two commands here, one that will build for development and have that URL in there, and then another one that will actually build for production, and that'll like minify my files and all that stuff. And in just a second, we should see what it looks like. Now it doesn't have that URL in here. It actually has a relative URL that Django can use to go read the file. And it also has information about my source map file. So Webpack supports source maps like crazy. and potentially Django could need this information as well. So the last step to hook up this Webpack Loader, if I open up my settings file again, is towards the bottom, I have this Webpack Loader configuration. And really the only thing important in here is this line where I point it to that actual stats file. So at this point, I've built my code. Let me go ahead and start up the Django web server and visit that in a browser. And we're still getting all of our code in here. And if I inspect element, this might be a little hard to see, but this script tag right here, I wish I could make this bigger. Let's see. Hey, it works. This script tag has the file hash in there. And every time that I recompile all my stuff, Django will automatically read that file name from that stats file, therefore automatic cache busting. It's a lot better than having to add like some date time query string at the end and have to remember it every time you build your code. Okay. So that's the basics of the Webpack Loader. It's pretty simple to integrate with. The next part is getting into Django REST framework. Excuse me. So normally in Django, we have models and views and templates. That's how Django handles the MVC thing. But when you're dealing with REST APIs, you generally don't have that template layer. That's kind of your single page app. So instead, you have to make the JSON thing work, there's a different layer that fits in there, and that's what they call it serializers. And it's the part of your app that will convert your Django models into JSON and JSON back into Django models whenever necessary. So let me go ahead and check out kind of this next branch, and we'll take our first look at what a serializer looks like. Check out serializers dash. Okay. So to start writing serializers, one thing that you have to make sure of is that Django REST Framework is installed and added to your list of installed apps. And then you just create, inside of your app, you have a serializers.py file where you write all of your serializer classes. And once again, the serializer class is just meant to take in JSON and output Django models or objects or Python objects, and take Python objects and convert them back into JSON. So if we look back at our models file real quick, we have a created app field, which I'm not using in the front end, so I don't even know if I pulled that in this example. I didn't. But the important one is a title field and a body field. So in my serializer, I create a class that inherits from this serializer class from Django REST Framework, which I'm importing up here. And then I just basically build out the different fields that my JSON will give, build the different, I add the fields that I will pass in as JSON, and also the fields that I want to be translated from my model back to JSON. So my ID field is just an integer field, title is a character field, and so on. And then the next step is this create method, where I take in this validated data. Basically, when I create an instance of my serializer class, I'll give it some JSON. It'll validate that it's correct JSON and matches the properties that I've set here, and then it'll pass it to this create function. And this create function creates a new instance of my post model, which I think it'll automatically save it to the database. Yeah, it will. And then the update function is very similar, except it passes me the original instance and also the validated data, and then I assign data to each property, providing a default if we didn't pass anything in. So this is a simple version, the simplest version of like a serializer. I'm going to really quickly pull up a different method of writing these serializers, because this could get very verbose, and you have a lot of lines in code when you're doing lots of these serializers. So there's a much more concise way to write these serializers. So I have two classes in here now, just to give you an example of what it looks like to do like a built-in Django model. And instead of inheriting from that serializer class, I inherit from a model serializer class. And then inside of the internal meta class, I make sure to specify the model, such as in this instance post, and then also the fields that I want to accept and expose. And then it handles the rest of it for me. It handles updating, creation, deletion, all that good stuff. So this is just a much simpler way to write these serializers. And if you need fields that only exist in JSON, you can just add them as instance properties here and make sure to expose them in this fields tuple, and then it will be able to accept and send out these special fields that don't necessarily exist on your model. Okay. One thing I totally forgot to mention back kind of in the Webpack part, so we're going to shift gears here for a second. In a single-page app, generally in a single-page app, you're doing all your routing on the client. So to make that work, you actually have to register a special route in Django that will catch every single URL and just return the same template. And that template will contain all of your single-page app code. And I forgot to show that off. So let me pull up, pretty sure this branch will have that. So in my main app, like my root project app, I'm registering the admin, so I can visit that if I need to. And then this right here is just a simple way to do a catch-all route. This regular expression will match every route and return this single base.html file. Which, because this will match every single route, any API routes or any special routes that you need to have in your app need to be specified before this one. This one will be a catch-all route afterwards. Okay, so now let's jump into the Django views side of things. And this is the part where we are using our serializer classes to accept JSON, transfer it to Python objects, or Python objects back into JSON. So next, let me just check out a function views. This is just this is the standard function-based approach for doing views in Django. Django has two methods of creating views. You can make classes that will do things like make your list views and detail views automatically, or you can do just function-based views. So let's step through this real quick. So we have this post list. I'm just creating one endpoint. I'm not creating all the ones that we would need. So this post list function takes in a request, and then depending on the request type, does some different things. If we get a get request, we grab all of our posts that we have saved in our database. We create an instance of our serializer class, passing in our list of posts. And this mini equals true flag is just telling our serializer class that it's going to have to like put all these inside of like an array, like a JSON array. And then we return a response with serializer.data, which is a string of JSON. And this response is not the normal Django HTTP response class. Instead, it's a special response that's imported from Django REST framework. Similar to on the post side of things, instead of creating like a actual posts model, we never actually create an instance of that. Instead, we create a new instance of our serializer class, and we pass it in the data from our request. As far as I remember, it can accept both like form-based data, or you can send it actual JSON data like over the request, and it will be able to figure out what you actually meant to do there. And then we check if it's valid. If so, we save it, which will actually create a new instance and save it to the database for us. And then if it's not valid, we just return all the errors back as JSON. I'm also a really big fan of how they decided to manage sending HTTP status codes back and forth, because whenever you create a new resource, you're supposed to send a 201 status code. And they make it very readable by having just a dictionary with all the different status codes on here. So there's HTTP 404s for not found, and 201s, 401s. It has a whole list of all the HTTP status codes available inside this status dictionary. And then on the URL side, we import, or sorry, this is our main app. I'm kind of namespacing everything inside of an API endpoint. So I'll hit API/posts, and that will trigger my view. Now if I go to my apps urls.py file, we have just a posts endpoint where we run that callback function essentially. So let's spin up the server real quick and make sure that this works. Server. I'm using Postman here. That's just a really awesome little app for testing out APIs. Let's see if I can zoom in on it at all. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do a GET request to that endpoint that I just created. And boom, it gives us all of our JSON back inside of an array with all the data that we had specified inside of our serializer. Also, I could make a post request, so I'll change this to be post, go here into body, and we'll just say post. Okay, and these are just actual request parameters that we're sending along with the post request. I'll go ahead and send that, and it returns back the newly created post model that serializer just created for us. And if I go back to making a GET request to that same endpoint, we should see that one that we just created right there. Okay, so these function-based views. Oh, one more thing that I'll mention about the function-based views. Views. Okay. REST framework provides this API view decorator, which whenever you prepend a function-based, or yeah, a view function with it, you can basically limit this function to only accepting these request types. So if we try to send a put request to this endpoint, nothing will happen, or it'll give us an error. But that's just a nice way to limit it to only these, if that's what you want. You still have to check inside the method, you know, if it was a get or post, but we never have to account for a put request there because it'll handle that for us. Okay. The last part of the views, you can totally write function-based views for everything, but you probably will end up repeating yourself a lot because this get and post request is kind of like the standard. You do this all the time when you're doing REST endpoints. So Django has a way to do, the Django REST framework has an awesome way of doing class-based views in Django. So check out view sets. And they call them view sets. So we're going to go ahead and ignore like this permission classes line for now. But basically, instead of creating a function, we just create a class that inherits from this view sets module, and then this module, this model view set class. And this is going to set up a lot of like interesting defaults for us. It will automatically create a GET request endpoint. So like for this one, it'll be /posts. Whoops. And it'll have that GET endpoint for us, and then it'll also have a post request to the same endpoint for automatically creating a new instance. And then it'll also give us some extra endpoints where we can pass some query parameters in. So if we do a GET request to this endpoint, replacing ID with an actual ID of a post, it will retrieve that single post for us. If we make a put request to that same endpoint, passing along some new data, it'll automatically update that model for us. We could also do a delete request to that endpoint to totally delete the resource. So this is what view sets are kind of doing for us. This read-only model view set, pretty much it's the same thing, except it doesn't expose a post endpoint or a put endpoint or a delete endpoint. It just won't let us change any of the data. It's a read-only view. there's kind of two parts to this, though, because we still have to hook these class-based views up to endpoints. So that happens inside of our URLs section. We basically create a new instance of a router class that Django REST framework provides, and then we register this posts endpoint with this post view set. And what's actually happening kind of behind the scenes here is there's actually a couple of methods that are automatically implemented for us from this class we're inheriting from, such as like a list function and a retrieve function and a create function. And what this router is doing for us is mapping the HTTP verbs that we'll send to that endpoint to those functions automatically. But there is a way to kind of take that router apart and build that yourself if you need to. But this is just a really clean, simple way of doing it if you just need some basic REST endpoints. And then the last thing we do is use Django's include function to include all of the URLs that that router class generates for us. So last thing about view sets is this permissions class. One thing that I mentioned earlier is that in our single page app, we weren't going to let a user create a new post unless they were authenticated. So this is just a way to make sure that we're adding a tuple here with this is authenticated or read-only class, which means that they can do GET requests and like option requests, but that's about it. If they need to do any creation or editing or updating or deleting, they'll have to be authenticated, and it'll handle all that for us. And we can show this off real quick. If I come back here to Postman, I can make a GET request. Oh, I got to start up my server. So I can make a GET request to that post endpoint. There's my list of posts. And now if I try and do a post endpoint, or a post request, passing in, we'll just give it the same stuff. It'll say authentication credentials were not provided, and it won't let us create a new instance of that resource. Okay, so that's the basics of view sets. There's several different ways to do class-based views in Django when it comes to the Django REST framework. You can, I forget which one it is, but there's like some mix-in classes that you can inherit from, so that you can like implement a get method that will only respond to get requests. It's pretty well documented on the Django REST framework website, which has actually really good documentation. So if you're ever curious about how to do all that stuff, definitely look that up. So that's kind of the basics of the Django REST framework that I wanted to get into. Just kind of based on this, you can already start implementing a lot of stuff. Like, you can build out your different models and then get to where you're editing, reading, and updating from your single page app just based on this. And then also, if you need to tear stuff away to get more customized, you totally can. So the last section that I wanted to go over was authentication with Django REST framework. How many have heard of JSON Web Tokens? A few of you. So JSON Web Tokens are a fantastic way to handle authentication inside of a single page app. The basics of how they work is that it's this string of base64 encoded text that's split into 3 parts, separated by a period. Let me look up like a diagram of what a JSON Web Token looks like. JWT diagram. Man, I'm not seeing any. But basically, it would be some random base64 text, and then a period, some more random stuff, and another period. Although it would be a lot longer than that. And the 3 sections, one thing that's really awesome is, this is going to get a little bit technical, but we don't have to worry about it. The application that the package that I'm going to pull in to handle JSON Web Tokens abstracts most of this from us, but it is a good idea, a good thing to understand kind of the basics of how it works. But basically, this first section is a base64 encoded string of what they call like the head of the JSON Web Token. It has some very basic information, such as because one section of this JSON Web Token is actually encrypted. So in the first part, if you decode it from that base64 encoded string, it will have information about the encryption type and stuff like that. This second part is the body of your JSON Web Token, and that actually has like information about your user. You know, you can pass like a user ID or something in through that, and then use it. I'm pretty sure you can like, there's ways to decode it on the client side to actually get that information out. And then this last bit is the key that the encryption key that this token was signed with. And that's how it stays secure. There's a lot more technical details involved, but those are just kind of like 30,000 feet basics of how JSON Web Tokens work. And to get those working in Django, there's an awesome package on PyPI that does almost everything for us. So if I go into my my settings.py file, let me go ahead and check out my branch for the JSON Web Token stuff. Check out JWT. Okay. And so we don't actually have to include it in our list of installed apps because it's not a full-on app. It actually just adds a class that we use elsewhere. If we look, the documentation says to add this REST framework section to your settings.py file, and then most of the stuff that's in here is actually just defaults for Django REST framework, but there is this one line here where we're importing REST framework JWT, this JSON Web Token authentication class, which is that's like the first thing that we have to do. The second is if I come to my main URL file, the second thing that we need to do is we actually need an endpoint that our single page app can send a username and password to and get a token back in exchange. And that's what's happening right here. We import this obtain JWT token view and expose an endpoint where we actually handle that. And that is it. That's all you need to do. Once, well, there's one more thing you have to do. Once you get the JSON Web Token back, every request that you send to the server, you will send that JSON Web Token back as well, and that's how it handles the authentication part. There's also some other options in the that the docs outline, because there's some other endpoints that you would really need to add in a real application. This guy. So let's zoom this in. So there's our obtain token authentication endpoint. The other important one is a place to refresh that token if it's going to be expiring soon, because generally these tokens will have like an expiration date kind of built into them, where the backend would decline it after it's past its expiration date. And then another one is just this verify token. So if at any point you need to verify that, like your front end needs to verify that a user actually is signed in, they could hit this endpoint, pass it the token, and Django REST framework would, or the JWT app that we use, or class that we use, would send back whether or not it's a valid token. Okay, so let me show you what it looks like to actually send this token back and forth. And then I'll get into one tiny setting that you would also need to configure. So I'll come back here to Postman, and if I go to my views file, we do have that permission class on there. If I try and do a post request to API posts, oh whoops, gotta start up the server. Whoops. Okay. So if I try and hit that endpoint right now, I'm not authenticated, so it says no, you can't create anything here. Now I want to hit that JWT auth endpoint. Is that what I used? Token auth. And to authenticate, I'm going to make a post request where I pass in a username, and that's going to be admin, and a password, and that's going to be, I had a really secure password on there. And I should be able to hit this endpoint, and I get back this token. And now, if I, Postman has an awesome little place where I can add a token that will be sent along in the headers, which is where that token is supposed to live. Basically, every request you would have an authentication section in your headers and basically say exactly what it's going to do right here. So I'll add the JSON Web Token, and we can like. Oh, thank you. Okay, now we'll update it. So if I look at my headers, Postman is automatically generating this authorization header for me and saying bearer and then the token. And this is where I'm going to point out the one little change that you have to make in your settings. Generally, when you're sending tokens back and forth, in your authentication header, you would specify bearer, but by default, that Django REST Framework JWT class wants you to use, instead of bearer, JWT, which for some reason Postman doesn't have an option for that. It just wants you to use bearer token. So there's a place where you can change that in your settings file. So if I go back here to settings, there's this JWT auth section where I just set the header prefix to be bearer. So now everything should be good. I should be able to actually hit that posts endpoint. And I have my bearer token in there. I need to change my body to send a title and a body. And we should be able to send, and we got through. It authenticated, it used the JSON Web Token to say, yep, you're authenticated, created a new resource, and sent us back. So that's the JWT side of it, the JSON Web Tokens. And that's, like I said, those were the three main things that I wanted to figure out. Was the Webpack integration, how to do basic endpoints, and then also how to do authentication well. So we have a little bit of time left. I can show off how some of the single page app works. As I mentioned before, it's a Vue.js app. I'm gonna check out my master branch just in case something's not totally correct. Before I jump into the single page app, I do want to touch on my Webpack configuration just a little bit more. So inside of Webpack, I have this special section at the end that is adding some configuration options when I'm in development mode. And normally in Webpack, like the basics of a Webpack configuration is you give it an entry point into your JavaScript app, and then you specify what transformations you want to happen on your code depending on the file type. So for instance, if while going through your JavaScript files, you're importing like some Sass files, you can transpile that Sass into normal CSS. So that's like the other big part. But what I'm doing in my development mode is I'm specifying a couple of extra entry points besides just my main one. And these entry points are hooked up to the Webpack dev server. How that works is I have this devserver.js file, which is just like a Node script that when run with Node spins up the Webpack dev server with hot module replacement and all that cool stuff automatically happening. And then I also set my public path, which would kind of I was talking about inside of our stats file. And it sets it to where the Webpack dev server is listening. So if I actually open up the app right now, which is running, whenever we come across a request for a JavaScript file, it's actually a fully qualified URL to our Webpack dev server, and so hot module replacement is automatically happening. Might be a little bit complicated. I'm also totally open to stay around for questions if anyone has any afterwards. But the second part of that is in my package JSON file. I have this dev script that will run whenever I run npm run dev or yarn run dev that starts up the Webpack dev server and then also runs my actual Python server. So that's why I ran yarn dev and I was able to open up the browser to this URL and everything's there. Plus if I change any JavaScript files, it'll automatically update in my app with the changes I made. Okay. So the other thing, the single page app side of things is fairly straightforward. Let me show off the client side routing. So this is what a view router configuration looks like. Basically, you set up an object for an individual route, you give it a path, and then a view component to render at that path. And then there are a couple of these components that I only want authenticated users to actually see. So I have this meta section where I specify that this component should only let authenticated users in. And then here at the end of the file, this section right here, every time that I'm changing routes on the client side, it'll run this little callback function that I gave it. And I just check to see if the current route that I'm trying to go to, if I require authentication. And if I do, I check with my central store, which I mentioned I was using Vuex for to manage, like the JSON Web Token and stuff lives in there after I've authenticated. I also have just a logged in state. If I'm logged in, this will be true. So I check to see if the route I'm trying to visit requires authentication, then I check to make sure that I'm authenticated, and if I am, I allow that to go through. If not, I actually redirect them back to the login page. And then I'll show off the actual like authentication bit, which lives inside my state management solution. I have this login function that you pass it a username and password. It hits that token auth endpoint, passes it the username and password, and then when it comes back, it runs kind of another function that saves it in my state management solution with the actual token. There's not a whole lot of error checking here. I would need to like make sure that I actually had a token here. This one instead will just like throw an error if the token doesn't exist. But this should really be set out to check that the token exists, and if so, then save it. If not, maybe show some error messages on the front end. That part's not hooked up. Also, there's a couple of, so if I actually go back to the front end here and log in, so I'm logged in now. This create post page, it wasn't in the nav bar a second ago. A user isn't even supposed to be able to see that page if they aren't logged in, but theoretically, if someone had this this URL, they could try to go straight to it. And I don't want to just like show them the page, but then show some errors if they can't actually create any posts. So if I go to that specific component, this is all the code for how it looks and everything, the actual markup. And then right here, this little bit will run as soon as this component is created on the page, and it just checks to see if we're logged in. If not, redirects us to the login page. This is also a great place to show off how the front end is actually making requests to our back end. I'm using a library called Axios, which is just a basic HTTP library for making post and get and put requests, and it's promise-based, which promises are really cool. And it, as soon as you create one, when it comes back, it navigates us to the individual detail page for that single post. And I'll show that off. I think I showed that off, but I'll just do it again. New. So if we create it, it takes us directly to the detail view. It's not super pretty. It's just pretty basic. But each of these will take us to a detail view as well. So all that stuff is I covered a lot. Probably went a little bit fast due to some nervousness. But if you have any questions, I'm totally open. Also, I'll be around for a while afterwards.
So when you configure your sort of dynamic API endpoints, and you point to, are they views or models? What is the terminology that each of the endpoints, like let's say you have
Like how does Django like when you hit an end? Repeat the question.
When you hit an endpoint, I'm assuming that's some sort of SQL backed.
Oh right, yeah. Sorry, I didn't even mention that. Normally Django wants to use Postgres, like that's kind of the de facto database solution for Django. For this example, I'm actually just using a SQLite database. It acts the same like inside of Django.
Right. How do you define that connection?
That's connection.
What does that look like?
So that is in our settings.py file. There's a databases section. Let's see.
The connection for the table, not necessarily the database. Like, are you having to? That's what I was asking. Do you have a different model configured for each?
Oh,
table,
so
or
when you create a new like model class, it'll automatically map that to a database
Awesome.
table. So like that's totally abstracted from
And
it.
then, do you have to specifically expose individual models, or does it automatically map all available models in the API? Like how
Well,
does that
we
work?
did that mapping kind of in our view, like in where
And
it.
it looked like you mapped to 2 models.
Yeah, sorry, I should have showed that off a little bit more.
No, that's
I'm
okay.
using in like Django comes with a default user class. And like admin users live in there, that kind of stuff, and which I'm importing that user class up here at the top from Django itself, and that's just kind of a default table that will come in Django. You'll have a users table. There's actually like a ton of tables that Django makes by default.
Yeah.
I think it even has like some stuff for roles built in.
Sure.
And basically this view that we create here, this view set, is what's mapping that model to an endpoint right there. Sort of. This is like the actual where the serialization part happens. The endpoint part happens in our URLs file, where we actually, wrong URLs file, where we actually like create this router that uses that view set class to listen on the different endpoints.
And those are the 2 lines I was referring to. So
Right.
if you wanted to expose additional models, you would have to add the different graphs.
Right, exactly. If I had a comments section, I would have to add that there. And like, I could potentially expose a comments endpoint by like copying this and going to like, forget how Django 2.0 does it. Pretty sure this is how the router would handle everything. And then I would have to look up the actual documentation for grabbing the ID out of it. But this would add endpoints for all of our comments, and it would be expecting some kind of ID to be sent along with it.
And then can you configure different endpoints to be, it seemed like there was a point where you were able to configure read-write if you're authenticated or read-only if you're not. Was that applying to this, or was that something else?
That was applying to this. So if I go back to our views file, there's this permission classes tuple.
So you can set that.
You can set that up there. And also, if you aren't using the class-based views, you could drill down inside a function-based view and do kind of all that manually. Right. It's just handling a lot of stuff for you. Also, this is a tuple of classes. So one example that the Django REST Framework docs gives you is they create an owner or read-only class. So unless you were the person that created this resource, you can't edit it. And you just add that to that list of classes there.
So you could have that and then like an admin-ish.
Yeah, you can have a is admin or read-only class. Yep, exactly. It's pretty slick. The serializers? Yeah, so in our serializers.py file, this is, I showed a couple of ways earlier of different ways to actually define these serializers. You can like specify all the fields and what data types they map to, but if you just pass it a model, it'll do that mapping for you. Yeah, this and this handles updating models, creating models, deleting models, all that stuff.
I was curious too, because I was like, surely it can't infer all of that from the query set that
Right, yeah, no, it can't. Also, as I mentioned earlier, any instance properties in this class, you can add as many as you want, and they'll just be representative in the JSON, not your model. So if there's, for instance, like another example is in the docs, like the walkthrough, you add a owner property to this model, and that only really exists in the, well, it exists in the model too, but in the serializer, you want it to maybe just be their username instead of the entire user class. And so you can specify that the owner property is just the username. Yeah, it is.
So it's kind of, it's essentially the same thing as if you were using like a property decorator on a.
I think it's a little bit different than that. The other thing that.
That it solves that kind of problem where you can have like a computed value.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. If you, instead of like using a property decorator, it is kind of doing the same thing. Let me look up the example real quick that they show on the docs. So Django REST framework, and we'll go see if I can remember where they have it. It's when we were building class-based views. So in their example, they instead of doing posts, which is a really simple one that I chose, they do like code snippets stored in there. So you'll see snippets, but that's posts in my example. Yeah. Is that good? Okay, let me see where that is. It's under, oh. I think that, oh, sorry, last one, relationships. Right, so here's an example of what that looked like. We created a new read-only field in our JSON object that maps to owner.username. I forget where it gets that. I think owner like lives on the actual model class, and so owner.username is just a property in that class. So this way, when we hit that endpoint, we will only have the owner's username instead of their user ID, email, all that stuff.
Do you know if that can be a function or is it only
This owner.
the like owner.username? Could that be a function if we need to do something more involved?
It's a good question. I'm not 100% sure. I'm guessing that it probably could be, like if you needed to do some extra fetching. Yeah, that would make things really simple.
But then again, maybe you could use a
The proper
property
decorator.
to do
Yeah.
what we're talking about.
Yeah. Or I bet you anything that this whole thing could be a function call that returns an instance of this with the data you need. That would be another, but the property decorator may work as well. Something else that I should mention now that we're in this, I mentioned that there were some methods inside of these view set classes, like a list method and a create method. You can also like override what a detail view looks like or what a list view looks like with some decorators. Where's view sets? Yes. So here's an example of like us overriding what the list view function does. Let's look at that. It's going to be in here somewhere. Right here. So like this, we're like entirely, as far as I remember, we're using this detail route decorator. And I think that this just means that we're exposing a new, man, I forget what this actually does. Okay, this is just doing some special stuff if we're making a post request to a detail view to like update password. But there's ways to override a lot of these like built-in functions that view sets provide you. Any other questions? Go for it.
You showed how you added the ability to do the web token authentication. I'm assuming since you had 2 or 3 different authentication methods in there, you could use any of those methods to authenticate.
Right.
They're all enabled.
Yep, they're all. Well, one of them was just like a base authentication class.
So
I'm not sure what.
Session authentication.
Yeah, and then one of them was session authentication. So if you do want to do session based, then yeah, it's totally open to you to do that.
So if you have a front end that needs JWT, but then you also want to expose the same API to customers through OAuth, you could certainly enable that as well.
Exactly. There's probably some Django REST framework things for doing OAuth out of the box as well.
I'm seeing that. I just wanted to know if
Yeah, right.
Turn them both on.
Yeah, and you that's just a list of like classes
Yeah.
for handling authentication.
Oh, that's how it works.
Yeah. So adding different types of authentication is really simple. Well, if there's no other questions, like I said, I'll be around afterwards. I'm going to help clean up, so feel free to ask me anything then. The code, like I mentioned, is on my GitHub page. Django SPA example. I will. Is there a Python group in the web devs chat?
There needs to be. Mike said that chat's open to create one. I'll add it right now because I don't think.
Yeah. If you add it, I'll post the link in there later. But yeah, that. In case you don't get a chance to look at it later, here is that GitHub repo. If you and also, like I had mentioned at the beginning, I've only been using Django for a couple of months. So if you think that maybe some of these examples could be changed because you might have more experience than me, feel free to shoot me a PR. I am totally open to accepting any pull requests to make this just an awesome, simple example for someone getting started with this kind of stuff.